My name is Bruce Chesse, and as you can see, I have been surrounded by art all my life. My father was an artist, and all these paintings that you see here and these marionettes were done by him. He was the most profound influence on my life. At the same time, he was a very difficult guy to get along with because he was focused on art. And how does a 2 or 3-year-old communicate with an adult with respect to his art? Yet as a child, I was completely obsessed with his art form. I loved what he did. I recognized it even at 3 years old. In fact, I would constantly get into trouble because I would go into and start playing with the puppets and they'd get all tangled up because they were marionettes and they were on string. And he would be furious with me. He never recognized that as an interest in his art. But at a very early age, I discovered that if I was ever going to get along with this guy, I was going to have to like the art as much as he did. What I want to talk to you about today is one artist's reality, my reality, and how the life experiences that you have will reflect who you are as a person and where you're going in life. Ironically, the more I find out about DNA, we find that there's a relationship between early strong role models, generationally, which will follow the family line all the way through to the present. It's called epigenetics. My father was a Creole. He was descendant from a slave. His great-grandmother was Justine Olivier, who had 2 marriages, brought herself up out of slavery, educated all 13 of her children, and set the path for them that many of us were to follow on down through the generations. Justine Olivier was a slave who brought herself out of slavery and became an entrepreneur. She educated all her children, so that all of them got good education, and put the family, 2 of the family, my great-grandfather and his half-brother, in business as tailors. The tailoring business became a vehicle through which all of the Chesses could go through, learn a trade, and survive on their own. They were also civil rights activists at the same time and considered themselves persons of color. My grandfather and my father were both into denial about their black heritage. My father never met his grandfather, and my grandfather never talked about it. And this had a major influence on my father and instilled in him a fear that he was never able to shake off, that he could not survive as a person of color. Even though my father was into denial, in fact, the whole family was into denial, his black heritage always came out in his art. So now we're going to go into the next room and see those influences of Justine Olivier and how they followed him down through the years. In 1928, the whole family, overcome by the Jim Crow and all the things that they had suffered in New Orleans, Louisiana, moved lock, stock, and barrel to San Francisco. And this was where my father's career in art began. Most interesting is the fact that in 1928, shortly after they had arrived, my father received the Anne Bremer Prize, which he had to split with another artist, because it was called the Black Madonna. And I don't think anybody had the temerity to paint the Virgin Mary as a black woman before. But it had its impact. But as you can see, my father's black heritage, he could not escape from it. He had to express it on canvas. And when you look at these paintings here, which are all of 5 very strong women, and very independent, strong women. And I can't help thinking that all of these represented some aspect of Justine Olivier, the slave great-grandmother that he was descended from. These paintings, when they were first exhibited in the 40s, were not very well received, because the art community at that time couldn't understand why this white man was painting black imagery. But what this represents is something that he could not get away from. He had to paint it. He had to express himself on his painting, and that was a path that my father followed all his life. He painted those things that he loved and cared about and had full meaning to him. The French Quarter in New Orleans in 1906 was the center of the Chesse family universe. They had a house on the corner of Burgundy and Kellerick near Esplanade in the Faubourg Marigny. The family home was built by Simon Esnard in 1830. On his death, my father's grandmother, Rosa Esnard, inherited the building. On my grandfather's father's death, the mother, Rosa, had the whole family move in with her. She died in 1907, and they lived in this house until 1928, when it was sold, and the whole family moved to San Francisco and went Passe Blanche. As her only child, my grandfather, Alexander Laurent III, was given every entitlement. As you can see from this picture here, he was the center of the family. My father is on his grandmother's lap in the far right. My father's father is in the center of the picture, and on the far left side, his wife was my grandmother, Marie Ticoulet, with Marcel. Marcel, who was the older brother of my father. When my grandfather took on a family, his father, the tailor Alexander Laurent Chesse, number 2, bought him a silver plating shop where the family lived a very routine, ordinary life until 1928. My grandfather had a regular routine every morning. Someone was sent out to get his dozen oysters to start off his day, and then he would take his children out for a walk in the quarter and pick up a few silver plating jobs. In the evenings, he would read to them. Oftentimes, he would read from the plays of Molière in French to them. The family was bilingual, so French was a language that was spoken during the day and in the house. He was not a very practical man. He was very set in his ways and eccentric to beat. On his walks, if he met someone who owed him money, he would cross the street so as not to embarrass him. In New Orleans, the food was brought to the people on carts, and the many carts would come during the day and my grandmother would shop. My grandfather was also, I might add, a junk collector who never gave away anything. Everything was to be had right here in the quarter. He made his own beer and wine, though, but never liked to wait for it to fully ferment, and often the things would explode at inopportune times. My father, when he was very young, was very fearful of his black heritage, irrespective of the fact that his grandfather was a civil rights activist. As you can see by this picture, he was even afraid of small dogs. Whenever a company came, that was always something that was very overwhelming to him as well. And that seems to have stuck with him all throughout his life. He was afraid. As my father grew up, he relied very heavily on Marcel, who was his oldest brother, who was very talented. He was a violinist, and he was also a very good artist, and he was the apple of his father's eye. My father's fears were compounded when Marcel died suddenly of peritonitis when he was 13. This was brought on by the fact that my grandfather was very cheap and had something of a quack doctor who misdiagnosed the appendicitis, which caused the peritonitis. The death of Mars was a huge blow to the entire family. I was so tiny I could be made to smile or laugh or cry by these friendly giants with their funny antics, or with words of reprimand. Large objects frightened me. Barking dogs terrified me. Loud noises, thunder, lightning, and howling winds threw me into a panic. This would send me running for the protection of my mother's comfortable bosom, which always allayed my fears. It was a strange, mysterious, unpredictable world full of strange people and unexplainable happenings, and I was apprehensive of everything. There were so many old people all around, people telling me what to do and what not to do, what to say and what not to say, where to go and where not to go. Then there were continual warnings, don't do this, don't do that. Ne touchez pas was the oft-repeated command. Well, you'll fall and hurt yourself. I was constantly protected by fears. Ralph and his sisters were growing up, and with Marcel's death, the family was thrown into a very deep depression. It was an event that would have a lasting effect on both my father and his brother Roland. With Mar's death, the sisters met a new friend, my mother, Josephine, or Josie for short. Things began to get better as the girls entered into their teenage years, and my mother entered on into the picture. Here's a picture of the three of them together. They would be fast friends all the way through the rest of their lives. As time went on, things began to flower between my mother and my father, as this picture indicates. The really joyous event in the family every year was celebrating Mardi Gras. This allowed the family to toss aside their fears and take part in the revels that accompanied the annual Easter celebration. My father would costume everybody and do makeup, and it became a total art project. And it was a time when everyone came together and could escape into their imaginations for a while. My father took great pleasure in taking charge of the organizing activities of Mardi Gras. It also led him to the theater, and he began working artistically very early on. And it led to his involvement with the Petit Theater in the Vieux Carré. Here is a picture that he did when he was only 18. At 19, he went to work at Le Petit Theater as an actor and assistant to the stage manager, Mark Antony, and he also was the lead makeup artist for them. His reward was small parts in touring companies that would come to town. He had his first art exhibit in 1920. It was in his art that he began to show a great interest in the black culture that surrounded him in the French Quarter. Although in denial about his black heritage, black imagery began to consume his interest. In 1921, he turned to block printing. So here are a few images, and you'll notice that these are mostly New Orleans background. He drew very heavily on what he saw in New Orleans during his childhood and his formative years. And he was making his comment on the black culture. Although he was in denial himself about his black heritage. It was very evident in his art and continued to be evident in his art all throughout his life. He kept returning to the black imagery. When Ralph first met Blanding Sloan in San Francisco in 1921, he was introduced to the art of wood linoleum block printing and etching. He lived in Sloan's North Beach Art Center, which was jerry-built from temporary housing left over from the 1906 fire and earthquake. My mother followed him to San Francisco in 1926, and while she was there, they decided to make a cross-country trip to New York and eventually got married there. While there, he worked for Aline Bernstein at the neighborhood playhouse and saw for the first time the Moscow Art Theater, the Ballet Russe, O'Neill's Emperor Jones, and the work of the American puppeteer Raymond Buffano. All this became major influences in his artistic life. Fresh back from New York, he was challenged by Sloan to create a marionette production of Eugene O'Neill's Emperor Jones, which he followed up with another production, Shakespeare's Hamlet, which enabled him to play lead parts in many of the major classical plays that would have eluded him due to his small physical stature. In these initial marionette shows, he gave jobs to all his sisters and brother, and each in turn found a husband and wife, which again changed their focus and broadened their lives. New Orleans was now behind them. This also gave his sisters Vonnie, Ding, and Leslie an opportunity to branch out into other performing areas. In 1930, my grandfather and grandmother bought a house on the Russian River in a place called Camp Meeker. This became a summer residence for all the family from the time we were young children up until we were entering high school. During the 30s, my father opened over 4 different marionette theaters and did such productions as The Mikado, Don Juan, Alice in Wonderland, in which they traveled and toured in this wonderful truck. He also did a production of The Crock of Gold, which was an Irish story about leprechauns, which was very successful. As well as doing marionette shows, my father was painting. And they would have, every year would have San Francisco Art Association would have an exhibit. In his spare time as well, he did roles on stage in exchange for a variety of design work that he would do for the theater companies that he worked with. In 1935, was a very pivotal year for my father, because that's when the WPA was created. And he was appointed director for the Marionette Theater Project of the Federal Theater for San Francisco. And he started out doing marionette variety shows, which were always introduced by one of his special characters, George Bernard Shaw. Well, this was very successful, and he also did a number of regular marionette shows, which he brought back from what he was doing in the 30s. But in 1937, there were some problems down in Los Angeles, and he was sent down to take care of those problems. And he was now made managing director for the Federal Theater Marionette Theater Project for all of California. And here we see a picture of his entire Los Angeles crew. My father, when he got down to Los Angeles, he wanted to do full-length productions, and the Los Angeles puppeteers were very stuck on doing variety shows. So he brought his old variety show from San Francisco to spice it up a bit. The conductor now became Arturo Toscanini. And the way my father set up the show and created the symphony behind Toscanini was to have shadow puppets in the background. So he was conducting to these shadow puppets. The Walt Disney animators began to show up at the performances. They were copying and drawing the Toscanini and the shadow characters. Now, a little later on, Fantasia came out. And my father always insisted that Walt Disney stole that idea from him. In 1939, my father was transferred back to San Francisco to perform at the San Francisco World's Fair, where he did a production of Pinocchio. And we moved to a place called Uranus Terrace. And these are some views from the house. This is my sister and I and my mother at the very tender age of about 4. I always like to revisit the house on Uranus Terrace, and here's a picture of me standing in front of it. It was a very exciting house. It was large, and it had a big front yard. It had a big backyard, and the interior was pretty interesting as well. Here we see the upstairs of 26 Uranus Terrace, where my father had his art studio. And this is the art studio. He had a complete view of San Francisco, and it was a very productive time for him. He did over 50 paintings. In 1930, my Uncle Roland got my father a berth on his transport ship, and he did a tour of the Far East, picking up soldiers in New York and coming up back through the Panama Canal and going to Manila and other points in the Far East. During the late 30s and 40s, my father began to do a whole series of paintings around black imagery. Some religious, where here we see the flight to Egypt. This is a picture of Susanna and the Elders. It was quite startling in one respect, but the thing that's so exciting about it is the fact that he now represents very strong black women. Here we see Jacob and the Angel, a family scene in New Orleans. And here is another departure. This could be seen as Hamlet with the skull of Yorick, or it could be the gravedigger in Hamlet. It has an ambiguity to it, which is very interesting. My father, all during the war, worked in the marine shipyards. This was a picture from the marine shipyards. Interestingly enough, this became something of a controversy because it was part of an exhibit of paintings that was sent to Russia on the Lend-Lease program, and they disappeared. None of these paintings, which were done by a lot of the muralists from the Coit Tower, never surfaced again. They're lost in somewhere in Russia. This is a painting that I gave to Simon Callow, and it's a very iconic picture. It's a picture of backstage, it was done in 1935, of a dressing room for a production of Volpone. And all the people in this picture were real. They were WPA actors. And one of the things about the WPA is that the little theater groups formed in the WPA went on to have longer lives than the WPA. This group of people worked until 1955. This is a picture of my sister and I. It's the only portrait that my father did of us as children, and I'm very attached to this one. It has a lot of meaning to me because it is one of the most positive statements he made about my sister and I as children. This is 26 Uranus Terrace, where my family and I lived from 1940 to 1956. It was in this house that my twin sister Renee, brother Dion, and me were to experience San Francisco in a way that was to dominate our lives immeasurably. San Francisco afforded us an opportunity to live a cultural life that few children experience in their lifetime. Both my brother and I began working with my father in his marionette productions at early ages. At 13, I was doing department store holiday shows, and in 1948, I joined the San Francisco Boys Opera Chorus under the leadership of Matey Bacon, where we performed with stars of the golden age of opera in the 40s. Interestingly enough, my interest in opera came about in the 4th grade, when every year we were bused to dress rehearsals of the San Francisco Opera by the school district. The post-war 50s was to be the most important years for my father. In 1952, he ventured into television with a program called Baron Woodley and His Friends on Channel 4, broadcasting from the old Sutro Mansion on Twin Peaks. Baron Woodley would interview famous characters from stories and fairy tales like Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf. In 1952, the show was then canceled abruptly. Following the show, my father was hired by the Latham Foundation for the Promotion of Humane Education to create a marionette show devoted to understanding animals and the environment. It was developed for KPIX as part of the Captain Fortune children's television program. Brother Buzz was a 20-minute marionette show based on stories by Dolores Wilkins Kent. The program ran from 1952 through 1969. Remarkably, my father was responsible for all elements of the production, starting with writing the scripts, designing the marionettes, and playing the majority of all the character parts, with both my brother and I playing Brother Buzz and Letty Connell Schubert playing Busy Bee, and taking on all the female parts as well. It was the longest sustaining children's program on the West Coast, lasting 17 years longer than Howdy Doody. It stood the test of time and became very iconic for its use of the environment and animals. Brother Buzz allowed my father at 53 to have a steady income, making possible his going to Europe for the first time in 1956. It brought him back to painting on a full-time basis, allowing him to pursue many directions with respect to his life and art. 1956 was pivotal to changing the course of his life as well as mine. It enabled both of us to make choices that were to have a profound effect on our realizing who we were as artists. For my father, it was a motivating factor in allowing him to take his painting to another level by exploring new forms and broadening his use of color and subject matter. It gave him a freedom of expression that had eluded him in many ways in previous years. It allowed him to come into his own by giving himself permission to step away from some of the fears that haunted him. My relationship to my father was always a difficult one, especially when I was very young. He believed in the old adage that children should be seen but not heard. This was something that I did not adhere to because I was what would be called in later years hyperactive or suffering from ADHD. Now, this behavior became apparent in school around the 5th grade when my teacher convinced my mother that I should be retained because she felt I wasn't working up to my potential. My response to the teacher was that I wasn't stupid, and if she retained me, I would graduate from high school with my twin sister in 3.5 years in spite of her, which I did. The stress from this happening led to my gaining weight in high school, and at one point I weighed as much as 200 pounds. My saving grace was that I recognized early on that to get his positive attention, I had to understand his love of art and theater. Working with him was a means to an end. However, getting him to take me seriously was not easy. I did not have the requisite skills, and it took me some time to learn how to earn them. To do that, I decided to move to New York. The decision to leave my family was met with fierce opposition by my father. He was convinced that I could not survive there on my own, in spite of the fact that he himself did exactly that at age 26. I have great instincts and have always never looked at life in the short term, but tried always to look ahead and farther down the road than my father was ever capable of doing. I was always able to accept failure and build on it. This was not a strong suit of my father's, and I was soon to realize that it was an asset that would pay off for me in the long run. Unlike he or my brother, I was not as dependent on enablers, but pressed forward to find other solutions when I came up against those who would try to define and tell me who and what I was to be. That's how I wound up dealing with a multitude of roadblocks leading me to enlisting in the U.S. Army, and the journey that I was to encounter in Ethiopia. In the final battle I would be engaged in to defeat those who thought they knew better than me in mapping out my life and controlling it to my satisfaction. 1956 was probably the most important year in both our lives. Having a steady income with Brother Buzz allowed my father to go to Europe for the first time. And there he found that he had come home. And Paris opened up new vistas for him and gave him the feeling that the city was a new home away from home. After 56 and many more trips to Europe, his artistic palette began to reflect a diversity of color and style. Still working figuratively, we still see the influences of the Impressionists like Cézanne, Monet, Manet, Rouen, Gauguin, and the stained glass reflections of the church windows. In addition, his palette begins to reflect the color of European cities he was visiting on each trip. On all his trips, he returned with numerous sketchbooks, with color notations and numerous photographs which were to give him ideas for paintings. Much of his diversity came from what he was seeing and experiencing. His painting becomes more abstract, including landscapes and wandering representational abstracts. Figuratively, the turmoil of the late 60s began to have its effect on my father. We lived in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood, and the hippie generation began to change that neighborhood, and what was happening there and in the Castro, where we had lived during the 40s and early 50s, began to change. And change was always a problem for my father. He was fascinated with the freedom expressed by the hippie generation, but repulsed by their loose morals, and in one sense, he subconsciously was envious of their lack of conformity. The 60s through the 70s and the 80s also brought ideas anew. My cousins Peter Albin and Rodney Albin, associated with Big Brother and the Holding Company, the rock group, and Janis Joplin, would take him to these rock concerts, which gave him more ideas for painting. In 1967, he was invited to exhibit at the Walter Moore Gallery in San Francisco with the rock and roll poster artwork of Wes Wilson, Rick Griffin, Stanley Mouse, Alton Kelly, and Victor Moscoso. In 1979, my father returned to Shakespeare with marionettes. With a grant of $5,000 from Doug Laird, who was a fisherman from Prince Rupert, Canada, I was able to produce a marionette production of Macbeth. My father built all the marionettes, designed the sets and props. My brother took on the chore of directing. I played Macbeth, Dion Macduff, and my father played King Duncan and the Porter. The production opened at the University of San Francisco's College Theater and was transferred to the San Francisco Aquarium Theater near the DeYoung Museum in Golden Gate Park. Later that year, in 1980, I encouraged my father and brother to move to Ashland, Oregon, where they could live more cheaply. My father was very moved by the Oregon countryside, and he turned once again to landscapes and to his black roots. It was there that he and my brother mounted their last classical marionette production of Molière's The Doctor in Spite of Himself. In 1991, after 3 or 4 strokes, my father succumbed of old age, and ironically, my brother died 4 months after him of lymphoma. Now we're going to go to San Francisco, where it all began in 1928. After the earthquake and fire, North Beach was almost obliterated. There was very little left down south of Stockton Street here, but it remained a very vibrant community and undergone a renaissance. North Beach has always been a multi-ethnic area and was divided into sections. This was Chinatown down here, across on this side with the Italians. The Basques were up further up the street up here, but it was a very wonderful meeting of cultures, and it was probably one of the richest cultural spots in the city especially in 1928, when the Depression was on and you didn't have anything to live off of. Here we are looking up Columbus going towards the Ferry Building. This was the North Beach section of town where the Italians lived. Here we are looking up Broadway, which is where the Basque restaurants and the Italian restaurants were, and it's where they sort of commingled with the Chinese. During the Depression in 1928, when my father first arrived here, North Beach was the cheap rent district. You could get an apartment for $15 to $25 a month, and you could get a storefront or a large studio for $25 a month as well, which is what my father paid for his first marionette theater, which was right where the Transamerica building is now standing. City Lights and Vesuvio was where the beat and the hippie generation came together to meet and talk and buy books, and was their iconic place during the 60s. Behind me is the Flatiron Building, and that's where Enrico Banducci started The Hungry Eye, where I got to see Joan Baez for the first time and all the major comedy acts that came through San Francisco during the late 50s and all through the 60s. Also was across the street from that was the Purple Onion, and that was where the Smothers Brothers got their, and Phyllis Diller got their start. This is 12 Adler Place, which is one of the first lesbian bars in North Beach. It also became a very central gathering place for all the gay people in San Francisco at the time. Of course, they didn't have to worry about the cops here because they paid off protection. This was the Tosca Cafe. This was a great gathering place for all of us at late night after the movies or after the theater. And I would take girlfriends here because we could get cappuccinos laced with brandy and they didn't card us. Further on down here, we come to the entrance to the Barbary Coast. Born during the Gold Rush days, the Barbary Coast was a loose 9-block area centered on a 3-block stretch of Pacific Street, now Pacific Avenue between Montgomery and Stockton Street. It was now called the International Settlement. Prior to the earthquake and fire, it was also the center of the red light district and the place to go for entertainment of any kind. After the '06 earthquake, it was almost obliterated. The Transamerica Pyramid is what replaced the Monkey Block, which was where my father had his first marionette theaters. In 1928, my father's whole family moved out here to San Francisco, and it was quite a move for them. They were away from New Orleans for the first time and away from the racism that was haunting them, and they were all very heavily into denial about their black heritage. But my father started a classical marionette theater where he produced Emperor Jones and Hamlet. In these classical marionette theaters, my father took his young sisters, who were all early 20s or teenagers, and they all came to work in the puppet theater. And he split the focus, took them out of New Orleans and brought them into this mecca of San Francisco, where art was at its creative height. And what he did in doing this was he sort of rebore the family and got them to focus on something apart from the troubles that they had in New Orleans. Behind me is the infamous and notorious Black Cat Cafe, which established itself in the early 20s and ran through the early 50s, and then became the Melvin Belli Law Offices. Here was a place where all gays were welcome, they were not harassed. The city paid protection to the police department, and a gay time was had by all. In fact, when I was making a film called The Experiment in Terror with Blake Edwards, which starred Glenn Ford, we had to haul him out of the Black Cafe and sober him up so he could make his next shoot up at the Roaring Twenties. It still had its fascination. This is Grant Avenue. the center for activity in North Beach for tourists as well as the people who lived here. There are many storefronts here and also bars and restaurants, and you could hang out in those places for days on end. Grand Avenue in 1928 was an important place for the artists. This is where they could live and have some really cheap rents, and it was also the road up to Coit Tower. The Coit Tower was built in 1933 on top of Telegraph Hill using Lily Hitchcock Coit's bequest to beautify the city of San Francisco. At her death in 1929, Coit left 1/3 of her estate to the city for civic beautification. The tower thus came to be. This is the mural that my father did for the Coit Tower. And you'll notice there's nothing threatening about it. And it's really interesting that also when you look at most of the paintings around here, as vocal as some of the artists were, persons of color were not represented in this tower. All of the artists in this were paid about $25 a month to work on it. So that's what they were interested in. Because it was the Depression, nobody had any money, and it was work. The portraits on the stairway were done by Lucien Labeau, who was my father's best friend and who wanted to go very badly to Burma and draw the war, and was killed at a very young age in the plane before, just as he got to Burma, the plane crashed. And so that was the end of his life. The only person of color in all these murals. This was Blackstone Court, where the whole family moved to in 1928, and it is exactly the same house. The only thing that's done is a renovation to it. I am chagrined. The Blackstone Court house has turned into a gated community. When last I saw it, it was all grassland with 2 little houses on it. This is 26 Uranus Terrace. Well, I must say I'm a bit overwhelmed just sitting here on these steps, because things have changed since when I lived in this house for 16 years in 1939 up through 1956. My father had been transferred from Los Angeles, running the WPA Marionette project down there. He moved us all up here to go to do puppet shows at the World's Fair on Treasure Island. And that's why we came back to San Francisco. And this is where we stayed, and really, it was where I grew up. And I don't think you'll find a greater place to grow up in. This is Wayne's grocery store on the top of the 17th Street Hill, just across the street from my house. When you look down 17th Street, you can see all the way down to the Castro. This is a very steep hill, and walking up and down it was quite an effort. And because we never had a car, I did a lot of walking on that hill. And at the bottom of that hill is Castro, which is the entrance to the Castro Valley. And that was our neighborhood secondary to the Haight-Ashbury, which was our first neighborhood, which was on the other side of the hill. San Francisco is very famous for a lot of its scenic wonders, and this is Vulcan Street, which is a wonderful little stairway all the way down to the Castro. And when I was a kid, I used to deliver newspapers. It was the shopping news. So I would walk down these with 200 papers on my back and drop off shopping news at each one of these houses on this wonderful, beautiful street. This is Statue Hill, which is across from 17th Street. During World War II, and we used to go up there and watch for planes, Japanese planes that were coming. And the whole inside of it was covered with pictures of different planes. This is Twin Peaks Boulevard, the road going up to Twin Peaks. But this hill here was a great playground for us kids. We always used to play and fool around on that hill a lot. And it was very steep. So sometimes we got stuck and we had to get the fire department to come up and get us off the hill. This is Roosevelt Way, and this house coming up here was where I lived later on in about 1959. I had lived in the basement on Roosevelt Way here. Now, Roosevelt Way was a very scenic route. It took the 43 bus, and it took us all the way down to Market Street, where the old Mint is. And that was how we got to downtown by the public transportation. This is the San Francisco Presidio, which is now called the Golden Gate Recreational Area National Park now. And one of the great things that we had was to go and explore around the Presidio, but more importantly, we went to Fort Point, which was the place that we had most fun. Now we're on the road to Fort Point. And that was a very exciting place for us as kids. This is Fort Point. This is one of the most exciting places to come to as kids in the Presidio. We either got here by bike, on foot, but as we became teenagers and somebody had a car, we'd drive down here. And this Fort Point at that particular time was closed. It was not a part of the National Recreation Area yet, so we'd have to break in. It looks like they got surfers out here today, but boy, during my day as a kid, there were no wetsuits. If you got out in there, you'd have froze to death or drowned. Looking at Fort Point here now, it looks like something like a glorified blockhouse, but in actuality, it isn't. It's within inside of it, if you could get inside, which we can't today because it's closed, but once inside here, it's a vast corridor out where there's a big marching field in there, and all the rooms were all around the sides, and it was 3 stories up. And when you got up there as kids, when there was no railings or anything, and it was a very dangerous place to be because you could fall off the top of it there, right down there, and kill yourself very easily. But that didn't bother us. We played cops and robbers. We played every kind of game you can think of, make-believe game in there, and we could spend hours just roaming around there. And that door over there was not very well fastened. It's been improved for the Golden Gate Recreation Area here, but we could break in, and that's what we did as kids. We'd break in there and spend a lot of good days there, especially when it was nice and stormy, because inside there we could be out of the storm yet in the storm at the same time. This fort goes back to the Spanish times. In 1793, the Spanish built it, and it was called the Castillo de San Jose, and it was built to defend the Golden Gate from the top of the cliffs where Fort Point stands today. Everything about this building is French. Alma Spreckels was a Francophile. The Alma Spreckels married into the Spreckels sugar family. They had made a lot of sugar in Hawaii, sugarcane sugar, not beet sugar. At any rate, it allowed her to build this edifice when she inherited her husband's money. This is the Palace of the Legion of Honor, and it is an homage to everything French and everything Parisian, including a statue of the thinker, a replica, to greet you. This is Rodin's thinker. What is he thinking? This is inside the Palace of the Legion of Honor, Alma Spreckels' homage to everything French. It's a wonderful museum and one of the most picaresque museums in San Francisco today. This is the entrance to a cute, wonderful matchbox theater here in the Palace of the Legion of Honor. And it has a great deal of sentimental value to me because it's here that I did my last performance on stage in a Molière play with my father called Le Femme Savant. I played his brother in this particular production. But it has great memories and was something that we both cared a great deal about. My mother was a rather extraordinary woman. She allowed us to have a lot of different varied experiences, one of which was to go to the Sutro baths down there, which was a tremendous place, and it was all of glass and had 7 pools, swimming pools to go into it. We could go down there, and it had slides. It was just magnificent, and it was a real Victorian masterpiece. This is San Francisco's Beach Chalet, another very iconic place. All the murals in this were done by Lucien Labo, and Lucien Labo was a mentor to my father and his best friend, and who was killed in a plane crash during World War II. It was quite upsetting to my father, but he owed a great deal to this man. Certainly he is the one who established my father and got him his place in the Coit Tower murals. This is the new De Young Museum in the middle of Golden Gate Park. This was a place that as children we were here every weekend when we could go, and because it had the museum, and then across the street we had the aquarium. This also has a great deal of nostalgic memory for me, because the aquarium is where my father and I and my brother put on a marionette production of Macbeth. Now here we see the bandstand, and the bandstand too has a little nostalgia for me, because this is where they would have concerts in the summer during opera season. And famous opera singers would come and sing in this bandstand, and I would be there every Sunday when they would have these concerts. And it was a great source of pleasure as kids. The Haight-Ashbury was my neighborhood, and this is where we spent a lot of time also, because it was right next to the Golden Gate Park. I also went to high school at Lowell High, which was just a couple of blocks away from the Haight-Ashbury. So it was an important part of my life all during my childhood and my high school years. Changed considerably now, and it was also became something else when the hippie invasion took over in the 60s. And my cousins, Rodney and Peter Albin, who was the head of the Big Brother and the Holding Company, they are the ones that brought rock and roll to San Francisco at a place called 1090 Page, which was owned by my uncle, and where they put on the first rock and roll concerts. It was quite interesting. The city fathers did not like the hippies, and they were instrumental in trying to drive them out of the Haight-Ashbury, but they weren't very successful at it, because the hippies knew how to use lawyers. It still has the flavor of hippiedom today as you go down and look at it. But it was the summer of love that gave Haight-Ashbury its iconic eclecticism. Crossing Market Street, we come up on the Castro Theater, which was a real haven for me on Saturdays, so I could see matinees of movies and cartoons. The upper level of the Castro we didn't much go into, because this was a Mexican American neighborhood, and you could get into trouble if you went into the balcony of the Castro Theater. We used to have Halloween parades every year down Castro, all the way through Castro Valley, and that was continued now with the gay movement, who only the parades are a little more colorful these days, and it also has a gay quality to it, although there was a gay quality to it when we were kids down there too. I can remember going dressed as Frankenstein and walking down the middle of the street, but I never got a prize. I never won the prize for the best costume. It was always a disappointment for me. I thought I always had good costumes. My mom made them for me.